Dan Natel for our first webinar for the trainee members of the Canadian Journal of Cardiology Editorial Board and reviewer list. I want to welcome all of you. Lindsay Jacoby is our guide and technical expert. By the way, Lindsay, the chat is still not working.
Okay.
We'll need the chat for you to ask questions. We have to mute your lines because otherwise the line noise would be too high and it would disturb the content. So the idea was to have questions online. However, right now that mode doesn't seem to be working properly. Lindsay's going to be trying to get in touch with our technical expert and see if we can't find a solution to it. I suppose if we don't, then we'll have to unmute your lines and allow people to ask questions orally. Okay, so the subject for the session today is on article reviewing, technical and practical considerations. I'm hoping that I will be able to take questions and respond because that's really an essential part of this. I designed a formal presentation first in order to give you an overview of a variety of points that I think might be relevant and of interest. But I think it's really important for you to be able to ask any questions that you might have and that come up. So this is an outline of the formal presentation that I prepared. So first, we're going to talk about the goals of the review process and what to think about when you're reviewing a paper. Secondly, how to judge specific components of the paper. And then I'm going to give you an express approach to reviewing papers, which you may want to think about. You may or may not want to use it right away, but something to give you a sense of how some expert reviewers will review papers quickly. Then give you an overview of the technical process through which papers go from beginning to end so that you can put what you're doing into context. And then finally, and I think most importantly, address any questions that you might have. So we'll begin by talking about the goals of the review process and what to think about when you're reviewing a manuscript. So the goals in general of a review process are to judge a paper's suitability for a given journal and provide the editor with clear and prompt feedback. Then to help the author by providing clear explanations of the basis for your recommendations. It seems self-evident, but it's really critically important for the author to understand why you gave the paper the rating that you did and why you think it should be accepted, rejected, revised majorly or minorly, and so on. Secondly, it's important to provide feasible suggestions to the author to improve the paper, even if it will not ultimately be published in CJC. Once you've gone to the effort to think about the paper, you can certainly help the author for subsequent submissions. One point is that it's not up to reviewers to provide detailed grammar and spelling corrections. On the other hand, if you do criticize the spelling and grammar and is not grossly self-evident, as in the case of someone from a foreign country who really can't speak or write English, then you should probably give at least a couple of examples of why you think the grammar is poor or the spelling is poor. Theoretically, language shouldn't enter into the evaluation of the paper as long as you can understand the paper. But obviously, in some cases, the grammar and spelling are so bad that you can't even evaluate it. We do have in our decision portfolio decisions that feed back to the authors that the paper might potentially be acceptable, but that major English writing improvements are necessary, and then we give tangible and concrete suggestions for ways that they can do that. Okay, so so much for the overview. Then having reviewed a lot of papers and discussed it a lot with my trainees, I've created a list of 3 simple questions that a reviewer should be thinking about when they review a manuscript. The first is, does this paper address a specific question or questions? Any good paper should address a question and answer it. In the case of a review article, it's obviously a little bit different, but there too the question should be something like, what is the nature of this process? What does the literature say about it? And so on. What do we need to know in the future? Second, did the paper provide an answer to the question? So obviously, if you can't figure out what the question is, it's very hard to know if they answered it. Any good paper should not only provide a question, but should also answer it. And then the final question, which is a value judgment, but a crucial one, is does anybody care? Someone could do a very careful analysis of the height of the average Canadian versus the average Chinese and show definitively that Canadians are taller than Chinese, but given that that is so self-evident to anyone who's been in either country, I don't think that would be a high priority article for any journal. Okay, so now what to look for specifically in the contents of the paper. So that first question, as I mentioned before, is what question did this paper address? Is it clear, and is the rationale clear? And that really relates to the introduction. The purpose of the introduction of any paper should be to clearly define the rationale for the hypothesis or the questions asked and to clearly state them. Second, did the paper provide an answer to the question? And that comes out of the methods and the results. The methods tell you about the approaches that they used, and of course, if there are major problems with the methods, the answers that they try to provide are questionable, and then the results tell you what they found when they applied those methods. Then, is this the first time this question has been addressed or answered? And does anybody care about the question and or answer? And that comes out of the discussion. So really, when you think about it, the standard parts of any paper should address very specifically these questions in the reviewer's minds. Okay, so there are also some journal-specific considerations. First, is the paper appropriate for CJC? CJC is a general cardiology journal, and certain topics are simply so specialized that they're not of interest to the journal. Does it deal with a topic that will be of interest to enough of our readership, or does it deal with something so specialized that it will be of little interest except to highly specialized readers? Now, one difficulty in thinking about this is that it's not as black or white as it might seem on the surface, because certain papers, although they deal with specialized material, are of such importance that they will be of interest to a much broader audience. So an estimation of the importance of the article factors in. So for example, a detailed wrinkle on a well-established, highly technical technique may only interest specialists in the field, whereas an entirely new method with important potential implications may have much broader interest. Okay, so much for the overall goals of the review process and what to think about. Now, how should you judge specific components of the paper? As we all know, the components of the paper are title, abstract, background, methods, results, discussion, and conclusions. The title should clearly inform the readers about what the paper adds to the literature. In addition, it should attract readers to the paper, and ideally should avoid a purely parochial focus. Because some of the papers for CJC may have been done in a specific province or a specific region, the title may include something like an analysis of outcomes of such and such in Ontario. I prefer to avoid that kind of title because that seems to be saying to the reader, if you're from Ontario, you'll be interested in this. If you're from Canada, you may be interested in it. And if you're outside Canada, forget it. So even if your paper was done in a specific place or a specific precinct, it's worth thinking about what this can tell the world and avoid making it too specific to the specific location. So that's a consideration, not in judging whether the paper is acceptable or interesting or not, but possibly in giving the authors helpful feedback about the title. Questions to ask yourself looking at the title are, does this title describe the contents well? And in particular, does it describe the most important findings of the paper accurately? And then secondly, if I read this title, would I be attracted to read the paper? If you look at the title and you say, I wouldn't have a clue what this paper is about just based on the title, or if I looked at this title, I'd say, forget about it, this has no interest to me, then maybe you want to suggest to the authors to change the title if it can be improved. Okay, the abstract should provide potential readers with a clear summary of all essential components of the paper. And those essentially follow the kinds of themes that I've already mentioned, and the topic headlines that we require for original articles in CJC follow those very closely: background, methods and results, conclusions. The abstract should make clear the rationale for the work, describe succinctly any major methods, and should summarize clear results. It should also conclude with a statement of the essential findings of the paper and why they're important. And you'll be surprised at how many abstracts are missing one or more of these essential elements. The abstract is a critical part of the paper. It should not be an afterthought. Remember that the abstract is all many readers will look at and what will drive them to read or cite the paper. So typically, if someone's doing a literature research, they'll go on PubMed, they'll pull out the list of articles. If the title seems to describe something interesting to them, they will probably open that entry and look at the abstract. And then if the abstract presents information that seems like it might be interesting or important, they'll be much more likely to read the paper or cite it. If the abstract is poorly written, unrepresentative, boring, suggests the paper has nothing new to bring to the literature, they're not going to look at it. So the abstract is a critically important component. Unfortunately, all too often people write their paper first and then write an abstract quickly and without giving it much thought. The background should summarize the literature that puts into context the goals of the study and provides the rationale for them. It should also clearly state the goals of the paper. And in my papers, even review articles, I try to have a sentence at the end of the background stating something like, the goals of this paper are, and then enumerate them. It helps, first of all, it helps you to structure your paper. It helps the reviewer to understand what the paper is supposed to be about, and it helps the reader to appreciate what to expect and what to look for. The background need not, and probably should not, be an attempt to fully review the background literature. The more detailed background review goes into the discussion when you put the findings in the context of the literature. The purpose of the background, again, is to create the case for the validity of the question you're going to answer and to address the reader's interest. The message should provide a succinct description of the methods used. In principle, and this is stated very often, a reader should be able to repeat the study based on the methods description. And one should note that a key issue in research is reproducibility, although unfortunately we generally get little mileage out of a study that simply reproduces a prior finding. Methods that are too detailed for word count limits can go into an online summary. Now, CJC has specific word count limits for each category of article. Some of them are very restrictive. For example, training and practice papers are designed to provide a succinct, practical approach to a clinical problem or a question, and they can only have 5 references. They can only have a maximum of 2 display items and a maximum of 1,500 words in the text. So obviously the author has to be very parsimonious, and in judging the methods, of course, there may be things that are missing, but if there are tight word count restrictions, you should be aware that the authors do have the opportunity of a detailed supplement. In fact, online supplements have no length limits, and so any methods that you think should be in there, and of course that goes for other elements in the paper, can be put into an online supplement. The results should provide in clear form all the results of the study that are needed to understand what the study found, including the results of necessary controls, population properties, key outcomes, etc. Again, if the author needs 20 tables to present their results, and that will push them way beyond the word count limits, they have to choose which ones are the most important and put the other ones into an online supplement. Display items, such as tables or figures, are key to transmit the findings of original studies and the concepts or the literature in review papers. Keep in mind that the display items are often the only things a reader looks at. In fact, I think most readers nowadays, when they look at a paper, when they go to do a literature search, they'll first look at the title. If it looks interesting, they'll open up the abstract. Then they may only look at the figures or tables, which are available often on PubMed, even without actually looking at the article itself. And even if they do look at the article, they're much more likely to look at the display items, and only if they need information that's specific to certain aspects will they read the paper. So be aware that nowadays very few individuals will read a paper from beginning to end, and keep that in mind when you're reviewing a paper. Helpful comments on how to improve the tables and figures, or what materials need to be put into tables and figures and aren't present currently in the paper, are really important to the authors. Graphs should be clearly labeled and identified, and that's something that reviewers often don't pay enough attention to. Graphs are often the labeling is minuscule, and so it can't be seen properly. The identification is difficult to see, so that's something you should definitely look at. And finally, again, material that needs to be available to the reader, but can't, and the reviewer for that matter, but can't be accommodated because of length limits, can go into an online supplement. Okay, the discussion should put the findings of the study into the context of the literature. It should state clearly what the novel aspects of the study are and support this based on prior studies that have addressed related questions. Novelty is a clear and key element of your evaluation of a paper. Any paper really has to bring new ideas, new information, or new ways of looking at things to the literature, or it really has limited value. The discussion should show why the results are important and why they're relevant to cardiovascular medicine. Obviously, the discussion should state any major limitations that the reader should consider, and as a reviewer, if there are important limitations that aren't mentioned, you should point them out. It should highlight any important major conceptual issues, whether issues raised by the paper or issues in the area that the paper addresses or that are important for understanding the findings. The conclusions are not, strictly speaking, a required part of the paper. We don't, in our instructions to authors, demand it, but all papers should end with some concluding paragraph with one or more clear and key takeaway messages. Ideally, in my opinion, one should have a subject or a subheading conclusions and state the conclusions after that, but that's not absolutely necessary. On the other hand, as I said, all articles should end with a clear concluding paragraph with the main messages. Important, the conclusions should not be simply a repetition or extensive summary of the results. It should really be a thoughtful synthesis of what they add to the literature. It should state any essential findings or ideas and why they're important. Okay, I want to just take a couple of minutes talking about the express approach, which I use very often when I review papers. We have reviewers for CJC that have an average review time, I think, of 5 to 10 minutes, and actually their reviews are pretty good. And this is something that can be helpful for you, obviously, if you want to return reviews over promptly, and particularly if your time is limited, but it's something that requires a fair amount of experience and ability. And so this so-called express approach is to look at the paper the way most readers will. Read the title and the abstract. Do they convince you that the paper might be adding something useful to the literature? Then look at the display items. Do the data indicate that the findings are novel and solid? If your answer to these two questions are yes, then give the paper a thorough analysis as described above. But if they're no, look at the results and discussion and see if there's anything there that changes your mind. If the answer is yes, again, go through the thorough analysis. But if the answer is no, then you can write a brief but informative and clear review stating why, in your opinion, this paper should be rejected. You don't have to spend 3 hours on every single review. Remember, this will accelerate the review process, save you time, maybe allow us to turn over papers quickly, but remember also, this is only either for professionals who've had lots of experience, or if you can see absolutely and clearly that the paper has fatal flaws that don't merit a detailed analysis. Okay, now I want to do a technical process overview just to give you a better sense of how the articles in CJC are handled. So any submission first comes to me, and then I take a look at it and see whether it's adequately formatted. If the format is grossly deviant, I may send it back for correction, or I may simply reject it. So for example, our case reports have a maximum of 1,000 words, 2 display items, and 5 references. If I get a submission of a case report that is 3,000 words, 15 references, and 5 figures, I'll take a look at it quickly. If it looks like it says something, it may say something interesting and important, I'll send it back to the author with the information that he or she needs to reformat it for us to consider it. If I think that even with reformatting, the article will be of no interest to our readership, I'll often just reject it at that point. So the next decision that I make, assuming the paper is correctly formatted, formatting in terms of general length and reference limitations and so on, I'll decide if it merits external review or not. If it doesn't, I'll reject it without sending it out to reviewers, and I probably reject about 30 or 40% of our submissions without their ever going out to external review, simply because they're clearly not competitive. This saves reviewer time and saves time for the authors as well. If I think it does merit external review, then I will assign an editor, and that may be myself, or it may be one of the 8 or 9 associate editors we have that are responsible for different fields. The editor may then decide that it doesn't merit external review, in which case they may triage it. But if not, it then goes to reviewers, and then the reviewers will obviously send in their reviews. When there are sufficient reviewers for decision, the paper will undergo a decision, accept, reject, or revise. Papers that are revised, that receive a revised decision, go back to the author, who will eventually resubmit it after revision. Papers that are accepted then get forwarded to our journal manager, who's Mary Ellen Smith. Mary Ellen will then send it to be copy edited, which is the process by which the article is corrected and put into format and typeset, and following that it's typeset to look like a journal article. The online supplements, by the way, are not copy edited or typeset. They will appear as just a PDF online that the readers can access by a link. The proofs then go back to the authors. Once the authors approve them, the article is published electronically, and then finally print publication will follow by up to several months. Jennifer Backey, who I believe is on this webinar, is our editorial manager. She handles all of the administrative and structural aspects of the journal. So if you have questions about technical aspects, if you have trouble with your login, if you have trouble finding parts of a paper, if something seems to be missing, then contact her. And in general, it's not a bad idea to CC me, especially if it's nights or weekends, so that if it's really something urgent, I might be able to help you. Okay, and now I want to look in more detail at the reviewer workflow in terms of what you specifically will be doing. So when the reviewers are invited, they can either accept or decline to review the paper. If they accept, then they have 14 days to review it, after which, well, towards the end of which, there are automatic reminders that are sent to the reviewers. I think there's a reminder 3 days in advance to tell them that the review will be due in 3 days, then a reminder when the review is due, and then overdue reminders to tell the reviewers that their review is late. If the potential reviewer declines, then an alternate is invited, and actually the way we set up the system, I usually, and other editors also, nominate a couple of alternates right away at the same time that we assign the primary reviewers, so that when someone declines, the alternate may be automatically invited. However, the reviewer can also suggest an alternate at the time that they decline, and that's very much appreciated because often we need suggestions of alternates, and sometimes the alternates that are suggested are actually better than what we had thought of ourselves as alternates, and we may go ahead and invite them directly. The third possibility, besides accept and decline, is that the potential reviewer simply doesn't respond. In that case, they get an automatic reminder after 2 days telling them that we're waiting to hear from them. They get, then we wait an additional day, and finally the reviewer will be automatically uninvited if they haven't responded by then. These categories, the auto-invite and the auto-uninvite and auto-late reminders, are bad outcomes. And I hope that none of you will experience them. We really don't like them to happen for members of our editorial board, and we're not thrilled about it otherwise. By the way, feel free, if you think you're going to need more time or if something comes up, to contact either me and Jennifer. Then at least we'll understand the delays. Crap happens in life, and we can postpone the deadline or even sometimes invite another reviewer if necessary. Just to put this into context, the top 10 reviewers for the journal handle between 23 and 54 reviews a year. They're almost all on the editorial board. And you won't be getting that many, so don't panic, but just to give you an idea of the kinds of reviewers that we have. And their average review time ranges from 0 to 7 days with a median of 3 days. So although you have up to 14 days to review the article, we really prefer if we can get fast feedback. One of the things that we can do for authors is try to review their papers as rapidly and fairly as possible. For all editorial board members, the average review time is about 5 days. So again, 14 days is the limit, but don't take that to be what you should be aiming for. And then again, I can't emphasize enough, you can contact us, and we welcome any questions, problems, suggestions. If you have help that you need, don't hesitate. Now, I'll be happy to take any questions if this is working. Let's see. Lindsay, are you there? Hello?
Hi, Dr. Nantel, I am here. Can you see my message to you? Or
I can't right now.
Well, what we can do, the questions do seem to be working, so if anyone has questions, they can type their questions, and what I could do for you, Dr. Nantel, is I can just simply read out the question to you for you to respond.
That would be great.
Dr. Nantel, the first question is from Mohammed Hussein, and he wants to know, is the review process blinded or open?
All our reviews are blinded. If the reviewer wants to, they can identify themselves at the end of the review. I must say that having handled thousands of papers and seen many thousands of reviews, we haven't had anybody who wanted to do that yet.
Our next question, Dr. Nantel, is, do you manage requests from authors who suggest reviewers?
Yes, that's a good point. So there's an opportunity in the CJC submission website to suggest reviewers, and I do consider those generally carefully. Part of the issue is the kinds of reviewers that an author suggests. So sometimes an author will suggest reviewer, and what I do is if I know the people and I know they're appropriate reviewers, I'll try to assign at least one of the reviewers to a reviewer suggested by the author. And if they suggest two or three, I might put the others as alternates. I do like to pick at least one reviewer who's not suggested by the authors. If I don't know the reviewer, then I'll go on PubMed and look at their publication list and look for two things. First, do they seem to be knowledgeable in the area and have they published there? And second, have they published with the authors? Because sometimes authors will suggest reviewers that are their buddies. And that, well, sometimes you can't tell that, and that's, I guess, okay. But if someone has published 15 papers with a potential reviewer that they're suggesting, I'll likely not use them. Sometimes also authors will suggest reviewers in their locale. Like I'll often get an article from China with 3 suggested reviewers that are all Chinese. I'm unlikely to use them because I don't know them, I don't know the relationships they might have, and I can't really honestly assess the likelihood that people have suggested someone that's a friend of theirs and who's going to review it in a biased way.
Our next question, Dr. Nuttall, is, are we able to get a copy of your slides? They were very helpful, and I would like to refer back to them when I review my first few manuscripts.
Sure. So what I suggest, Lindsay, I think you have the slides, right?
Yes, I do, and I can send out a copy to everyone.
Right. So I suggest that Lindsay send out a copy of the slides to everyone who was invited. Some people couldn't attend today, and the slides may nevertheless be useful to them. And we're planning to put the recorded webinar on the probably CCS website with a link to CJC. So people who couldn't attend today will be able to review the webinar as a whole and the slides. We might also consider, and I hadn't thought about this before, Lindsay, but we might also consider making the slides available as a standalone on the website, just so that if people want to run through the slides and not bother having to listen to a whole webinar, they can access them.
We can certainly do that. We have another question here that asking, when are we able to provide our areas of expertise? Okay,
so I think Jennifer's on the line. Is she, Lindsay?
Jennifer's on the line. She is muted.
Right, that's fine. So well, actually, we'll have her unmuted for a moment anyway so she can introduce herself. But Jennifer will be sending out some information. She'll be, well, why don't you put Jen on the line? Why don't you unmute her?
I've attempted to do that. Just one moment.
Is that not working?
It's not I believe now it is.
Yeah, it should be working now. Hi.
Hi. I guess some of the members are not signed into the system yet. Is that right?
I believe they all are.
They all are. Okay, and so they received the standard opportunity to go to the site and put in their interests?
I believe that, yes, I think that when we register them, they receive an automatic email from the system asking them to go and fill out the complete form.
Okay, so what I suggest then, because I'm really glad someone raised that question, my ability and the ability of the associate editors to assign papers to reviewers depends very largely on an accurate description of their interests. And CJC has a set of 4 categories. I think it's discipline, disease, interest, and technique. And there are a lot of entries in those categories which would allow you to describe accurately what you are interested in and what you think you're expert in. And then we rely on those become category terms or search terms when a paper comes in and we're looking for reviewers. So I strongly encourage you to fill that out properly, and I will suggest to Jen to send out an email to all of the trainee members, walking them through the steps they need to take in order to update, to add, or to correct their classification terms under their personal website. So Jen, you can do that, can't you?
Yes, I can do that, Dr. Natal.
All right, great. So you'll all be receiving an email from Jennifer giving you specific steps to take to put in your descriptive terms. And I would strongly urge you to not rush through it and just pick 2 or 3 things that seem reasonable, but to go through the categories fairly carefully and to pick out the ones that you think describe you well. I would say that if you put in too many categories, you may be getting a ton of invitations and maybe more than you want. If you put in too few, then we won't know what you're interested in and what you can help us with. So I would say somewhere in the range of 4 to 8 terms is probably best. And of course, it depends on the individual, but you'll see that there are many descriptive terms by those 4 categories, which will help. By the way, one category which is probably not useful to choose is cardiology, because we have hundreds of people with that descriptor, and so I almost never do searches with cardiology simply because I'm going to get hundreds of people and it's not helpful.
The next question, Dr. Natal, how do you choose reviewers? Is it based on their specialty, for example? And how is this going to be applicable to us as trainee reviewers?
A very good question. So it's really a case-by-case decision. I can give you some of the general methods that I use. So if I get a paper in a specific area, if I happen to know offhand certain reviewers that will be ideal to review it, I'll pick a couple of those right away. It happens, but not so frequently, that I'll just know offhand the names of 3 reviewers to request and 3 alternates to include. So usually then I'll go and look up potential reviewers. The way I usually do that is I'll pick out a key term. When the authors submit an article, one of the questions they're asked is to give classification terms, which are the same terms that you use to describe your interests. And so I'll look at the article and I'll look for some term that I think is the most discriminating, or terms that are the most discriminating for the kinds of reviewers that I want, and then I'll go on the website and I'll choose based on the descriptive terms and based on a couple of other issues. One is the average review time. So if an author is chronically overdue, if a reviewer is chronically overdue, I'm unlikely to invite him or her to review. If a reviewer is particularly fast, I'm much more likely to pick them. I also look at if they have another article to review. I'll rarely ask them to review because I don't want to at the same time, because I don't want to overwork our reviewers. And if they've reviewed an article recently, I'll tend to avoid them for at least a few weeks in order to give people a break. Now, that doesn't always happen. There's some people who are particularly expert and do a lot of reviews and don't mind, and if they have an article that's right in their area, I might ask them, but otherwise those are the kinds of general criteria. Now, I do tend to try to pick a couple of reviewers that I think are really, in my mind, optimal, and then I'll often pick a sort of take a chance 3rd reviewer, which might be, for example, in the case of the trainees, somebody who's never reviewed a manuscript before, but I know they're a trainee reviewer and their interests line up with the article, and then I'll pick one of them so that at least the author will have the benefit of a balance between experienced reviewers who I know are likely to give an excellent review, and maybe less experienced or established reviewers that I want to give a chance to, and often they will provide good reviews. I have to say that some of the more junior reviewers and the trainee reviewers that we have had, because we do have reviewers who are trainees that haven't been in the formal training program, are really outstanding. So it's not because someone is a trainee that I'm going to be suspicious of their ability to review. And I don't think Jennifer has done this yet, but under people notes, so we have one category in our reviewer selection software that allows for what's called people notes, any kind of specific notes that the editorial staff want to indicate to personalize information about a reviewer, and we'll put into those people notes, and maybe even into, we might be able to create a formal category on the review site of trainee reviewers, but at the very least they'll all be identified in the people notes. So that way we'll know who are trainee reviewers, and we'll know to try to give them a chance in their review areas and try to get them some experience. And that'll be particularly true for trainee members of the editorial board. All editorial board members are identified and their names come up first when we're looking for potential reviewers. So the trainee members of the editorial board are likely to get at least a moderate amount of traffic.
Our next question, Dr. Untitled, are we expected to go over all our reviews with our mentors or just the first few?
Okay, so I really think that that's a judgment call that personally I'd be happy to hear other people's opinion about it, but I feel comfortable. I think anyone who's interested enough in being a trainee member of the review panel and certainly of the editorial board is, I think, responsible enough to judge whether they need help or not in reviewing a specific paper. So certainly if you have any hesitation at all and you want to have your mentor look over your review or help you with it, that's great, and you can do that for every single review. But if you judge it appropriate, you can start out having them look at your reviews in detail, and when you feel more comfortable, just have them take a quick look over it. Or if you really feel confident in a specific paper and your ability to review it, I don't think we should make it an absolute rule that you have to pass it through your mentor. I really feel comfortable leaving it up to the responsibility of the trainees.
Excellent. The next question, how do you handle diverging opinions from two reviewers?
Okay, that's a very good question. So what I tend to do, sometimes, very rarely, I'll ask for a third expert opinion. By the way, I tend now to get 3 reviews rather than 2, simply because it'll give me more information and input. And what I'll typically do is I'll ask for 3 reviewers, and if I get a clear decision facilitating set of reviews before I hear from the 3rd reviewer, then what I'll do is, if it's a clear reject decision, I'll email the 3rd reviewer and say, I've gotten 2 reviews already and this paper is headed for inevitable rejection, so I'd rather you not waste your time on an unnecessary review, and I've gone ahead and made a reject decision on it. And I do that moderately often, and I must say I've never had a complaint about it, and on the other hand, I've probably had the order of 100 reviewers thanking me for informing them and letting them off the hook and not having to do the review. So that's the issue of multiple reviewers. So sometimes it does occasionally happen that a review is split and I need external expertise, and I will invite a 3rd reviewer, and generally then I'll invite someone who's an associate editor or a member of the editorial board who I know well and who I can ask for a quick opinion on the paper. And I may not even ask them for a formal review. I may ask them to, I may give them the option of just sending me their opinion, and if they side strongly with one of the other reviewers, I may go with that. The other thing is, most of the time when there are 2 divergent reviews, I look at the manuscript myself and I decide which of the 2 seems more accurate. So if one reviewer recommends reject and one gives it a high priority, let's say minor revision, I'll look at it and see if I think that the reject opinion is well founded or not. And if it is, my bias tends to be more towards the reject opinion simply because we're overloaded with manuscripts and dealing with a backlog. But certainly I'll look carefully at the paper, and if I think it does have a useful point to make, then I will either add my own comments to the review and indicate to the authors what they need to do to get the paper to be accepted, or I'll invite a third reviewer at that point.
Do you have an editorial meeting to make final decisions on papers, or are these made by individual editors?
So we don't. So I know that some journals have editorial board meetings once a week. Very few journals can actually discuss all the papers at those meetings. Usually they only discuss papers that have a divergence or have where there's important decisions to be made. We've never had formal editorial board meetings, and the main reason for that is that our associate editors are all over the place across the country, and we would only be able to do it by teleconference, and it starts to be very impractical. So the way the decisions are made is if I handle the paper, then I make the final decision. If I need input on it, which doesn't happen that often, but sometimes does, then I'll reach out to one of the associate editors whose judgment I trust on that particular paper and ask for their opinion. All the associate editor decisions have to go through me, and that's a recent phenomenon. For about 5 years or 6 years, associate editors made their own decisions and sent out the letters. But we had to change that system because we had a rapidly increasing backlog, and there was no way for an overall policy control of acceptance criteria. So now I have to make the final decision on all papers. So what happens is if I handle it, I make the decision. If the associate editor handles it, he, unfortunately so far, all of our associate editors are he's, but I think next year we're going to have at least one she. The associate editor will make a recommendation, and then I'll look at that and look at the paper, and in 90% or 95% of cases go with what the associate editor recommended.
Do reviewers have a chance to review papers that go beyond their field, or is this not recommended as new trainees?
I would suggest that certainly I try to for new trainees to stay in their field, and I don't usually send out papers to people when the paper is really totally beyond their field. I try to stick with the interest areas of the reviewers. I mean, after all, the author in submitting their article are expecting and hoping for a review by someone who knows the area well and can judge it fairly and honestly. And I would not be too favorable to giving people experience in areas other than their own for their benefit. I mean, I understand that there is a lot of benefit to reviewing papers. It keeps you up in aspects of the literature, gives you a chance to participate in the scientific process. It gives you experience in what reviewers look for. It allows you to have a sense of what kinds of articles get accepted or rejected and why. So there are many benefits, but ultimately the role of the reviewer is for the authors and for the journal, not for their own benefit. So I would be reluctant to do something that might benefit reviewers that would be to the detriment of authors.
We just have a few more questions here. The next one is, do we get feedback on the quality of our reviews?
That's a good question. So we handle a lot of papers, and to give formal feedback on every review would be logistically impossible for the editors. What you do get is whenever someone reviews a paper, they will get the decision letter and the comments of the other reviewers. So that will certainly give you a sense of whether your review was on or off target and how it compared to the editor's decision and the other reviewers. If particularly for trainee members, if you do want specific feedback on a review, and particularly for your first reviews, feel free to email me and ask me, and I'll be happy to look at it. And the answer may be very brief, like, no, it was great. But I'll be happy to give you feedback, and if I do perceive limitations in the reviews, then I'll let you know if you ask about it. The other feedback reviewers get is that they all get a performance report. In fact, Jennifer is in the process of preparing the performance reports for our reviewers. They get an annual performance report which tells them how many articles they were invited for, how many they accepted, their delays, how many were late, and so on. So that's just statistical feedback. It doesn't tell you much about the quality of your reviews. But I think between looking at what the other reviewers said and what the editorial decision was, and specifically asking me if you have any doubts or questions about a specific paper or a review, I think you should be able to get some reasonable feedback.
That looks like it's all of the questions we have at the moment. Are there any other questions for Dr. Nantel?
I have a question for the trainees. How many articles do they? Two questions. First question: how many articles well, I guess it's one question. How many articles would you like to review per year, and do you think you're capable of reviewing with quality and fairly reasonable turnover time? Can you just send your answers to Lindsay? I'd just like to get a sense of the range so that I can try to gauge how many I send out to the training members.
The first response here that I've received is 12 to 20. 12, about 1 per month. 10, some people have suggested. 4 to 6. Someone's saying once every 2 weeks. So there's a range, Dr. Nantel. I can certainly keep track of these and send you all of the responses.
Sure. I would think that we can try to, and of course it depends on the papers we get, so that if we don't get papers in your interest areas, we just don't. But we can try to send the trainee members, I would say the members of the editorial board, at least one paper a month, and the trainee members on the reviewer list who are not on the editorial board at least once every couple of months. That sounds kind of in line with the numbers that you seem to have been getting. Any other questions before we sign off?
It looks like that's all, Dr. Nantel.
Can people send one more question? I have one more question. Can the attendees send Lindsay first just a general comment on whether they found this useful, and then if they have any specific suggestions for improving this type of webinar, send it either right now to Lindsay or you can email her and follow up. First, a sense of how useful you think it's been, perhaps on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being great and 1 being awful. I don't know who's saying what, so I won't hold any.
For any of you who don't have my email, if you have suggestions about how we can make this more useful for you next time around, my email is Jacobi, Jacobi, @ccs.ca, and I would be happy to hear how we can improve this for future years.
Did you get any feedback on the usefulness of the enterprise?
I've gotten it was very useful. On a scale from 1 to 10, it was 10 out of 10. I have quite a few comments here that I'll collate for you, Dr. Nantel.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. And don't hesitate to give critical comments or whether constructive criticism or even if there are things that you thought were uninteresting or not useful, you can feel free to let us know. As you know, any researcher or physician has had plenty of opportunity to have thick and hide, so we can take any criticisms. So I guess we sign off now, Lindsay?
That's everything. Thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us this evening.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Lindsay, for your wonderful help.